Morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Shushak, and I'm the pastor here at Edges. I'm grateful always to get to be with you, and I come every week back to our community because I can't tell myself those things the song just said. Don't give up, don't let go, don't lose hope, don't lose trust. Those aren't things a person can tell herself. Those are things a person needs to hear from someone else, and I hear it from you, and I see it alive in your lives. And it helps me know that we can trust the one who we give all our fears. And you just can't make that stuff up, so I keep coming back. We're in the middle of a series, our final series in the Hold On to What's Good year that we've been spending together. And we're asking ourselves, what else is good? What are the tidbits, the snippets, the next thoughts that we want to be sure we don't forget to hold on to? And so I look forward to sharing with us together today about perhaps what might be another snippet that some of us need to hold on to. And it's summer, so I've been waiting until summer to share with you a boat story. It's because I figure who's been on a boat already this summer? Even if you haven't, just raise your hand so I can feel like it's a relevant topic. Everybody, if you've ever been on a boat, if you've seen a boat on TV, if you have watched Love Boat, raise your hand. See, this is so relevant already. We're ready to go. All right, so I don't know if you've ever had a really bad boat experience before, but I've had one. Say, what was it, Kelly? I'm so glad you asked. When I was 13, my grandparents took me on a cruise. It was my first cruise, and I didn't know that whenever you go on a cruise, they do a safety briefing, much like you do when you're on a plane. Only when you're on a cruise, you act it out. I guess they figured you've got a little bit more room. So you get on your life jackets, and you all report to your stations, and it's hot, and it's moldy, and it's humid, and you don't even like these people yet, but you're there, and after a long time, they come on the loudspeaker, and they tell you that you've passed the safety briefing, and now you are free to roam about the cabin, as if you would roam anywhere else. I mean, where else would you go when you're on the... So whatever, you go roam about the cabin, and when I was 13, we did our safety drill with my grandparents, and off we went. Within a few hours after the safety briefing, I was really struggling to breathe. But nonetheless, the ship had already sailed. We were heading out to high seas. But by the next morning, I was much worse. I was a severe asthmatic as a kid. Something was wrong. So we reported to the ship's doctor, who seemed totally stumped by the combination of life jacket mold and severe adolescent asthmatic. Right in front of us, he got out literally one of those big medical books and just started to look stuff up. This was not comforting. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was getting a shot of something that caused me to have terrible hallucinations as a 13-year-old girl. And it didn't control my asthma at all. In fact, it only made it worse. So after a few very scary hours, they made another announcement on the ship's loudspeaker that our boat would dock as soon as possible in order to ground a sick passenger. I will never forget the experience of being rolled off that ship in front of all those people while I was struggling to breathe into the arms of my parents who had somehow flown to some Caribbean island to rescue me. So, I'm no boating crisis expert, but I do think I understand a little something about that Bible story where Peter also has a near disastrous boat experience. The vivid story comes from Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33, and if someone would look it up and let us all know what the number is in case we want to follow along, that would be great. Really? Nobody's going to look it up? Matthew chapter 14. 562. Thank you, Luke. 562 if you'd like to follow along. In your tables. All right, so it's the same kind of moment, I think. A very scary one that nobody predicted would happen. See what you think as we read this story together. Right then, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead to the other side of the lake while he dismissed the crowds. When he sent them away, he went up onto a mountain by himself to pray. Evening came and he was alone, but meanwhile, the boat, fighting a strong headwind, was being battered by the waves and was already far away from the land. Very early the next morning, he came to his disciples walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified, and they said, "It's a ghost," and they were so frightened that they screamed. Just then Jesus spoke to them. "Be encouraged. It's me. Don't be afraid." Peter replied, "Lord, if it's you, order me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." Then Peter got out of the boat and was walking on the water toward Jesus. But when Peter saw the strong wind, he became frightened. And as he began to sink, he shouted, "Lord, rescue me." Jesus immediately reached out and grabbed him, saying, "You man of weak faith, why did you begin to have doubts?" When they got into the boat, the wind settled down. Then those in the boat worshiped Jesus and said, "You must be God's Son." What good can we learn from a story like this? I imagine some of us have heard this story before. The takeaways many of us have heard are probably many. Here are a few. I invite you to think of your own. I'm going to ask you to share a few in a moment. Maybe in the middle of life's storms, when we are very afraid, Jesus comes to help. Seems obvious. Or maybe even if we only have a little bit of faith, Jesus can still save us. Or the storms of life are never too much for the long arm of Jesus. It's one from my upbringing. Or how about the bumper sticker? Sometimes God calms the storm. Sometimes God, you haven't seen it. Sometimes God calms the storm. Sometimes God calms the child. Wow, I am the only one who has ever seen that bumper sticker. Okay. More nuggets. What are some nuggets you have taken away from that story before or that you heard today? One-line lessons. You can think. You got to get out of the boat. Okay. I'll wait. You sink when you take your eyes off Jesus. Okay? Peter had to choose. Peter was left with a choice whether or not to take Jesus' hand when he was sinking. You have to put your faith in something larger than yourself. Keep your focus. Good. One more. Our faith is what helps keep us afloat. Sure. So I waited on you for that because what we have just done and keeping on doing that always is such an important exercise. Whenever you read the Bible, it's always a good idea to ask, what's new? What else is good? It's always great when reading the Bible to never assume that you already know what something is going to tell you or that there's nothing left to know. Because the Bible itself promises that it's living, so it's like any other living thing. You never can know it fully. You have to keep knowing it over and over again. There's always a next chapter. So I'd like to invite us to do that again this morning, this week. As I was reading this story for about the 1,000th time, at first I thought, there's nothing new here. just bumper stickers. I kept pressing myself, is there more? Is there something more? Is there more good to hold on to? So I started to daydream the details all over again. This is an exercise I often do when reading Scripture. I try to daydream every little detail, see what it is that God will help me come up with next. Just after a big crowd of people that included Peter and his friends, just after they watched Jesus conduct another real-life miracle, something they can't deny, they just get sent by Jesus back to their boats. Now, this is where they'd spent their whole careers before they met up with this extraordinary character and before they got sucked into this unbelievable season of adventure and of purpose. But now they're just back in their boats. They should have seen it, that life would just return to normal, that was unsustainable, that ordinary was what they had always known, and it probably had been a mistake for them to hope it would be any different. Almost immediately, the old sting of the hand they had been redealt was magnified by the fact that this was not a good day to be on the water. Storms were a regular part of the fishing career pattern. In fact, to tell you the truth, in their lives, there were usually more bad days than good. What they did was not glamorous. This particular wind and waves was just one more in the regular string of the hardest kinds of days to get through. You know those strings, right? There was an enormous swirl about them where it was almost impossible to keep their little dinghy on course. And so pretty quickly, Peter and his shipmates become exhausted and probably grumpy and disenchanted. You know days like that, right? This downpour was so bad that Peter had actually become afraid too, which is a consequence of many of our life situations. Fear works its way in. It was a no good, very bad day for Peter, the kind many of us have also experienced. In real life, these kinds of storms can last for days or weeks or months, sometimes even years. Usually they're the kind where you either run for cover or you just hunker down in the corner of the boat and wait for it to pass. How do we cope when those are our moments? Sometimes it's gray for miles and there's not much you can do about it except close your eyes and just hope it will be over soon. But in the first half light of morning, Peter risks. He squints his eyes a little bit. He looks out upon the darkness and he saw a figure. And the first indication that the figure was real comes from inside Peter's own body. The very first thing he has to do is pay attention to what's happening inside him. A hunch, a nudge. He realizes his body is capable of feeling something underneath the hard, rigid, damp clothes that have become a protected shield around him. Even in the first seconds, Peter has the sense that whatever it was out there in the storm, whatever that is, maybe it would change everything. Maybe it would change something. He sees something outside himself, like some of you just said. Though the thought scared him to death, it also must have made him feel alive, right? And then the ghost that he sees on the water, the ghost spoke. It spoke to him. And the familiar sound of its voice jolted Peter beyond the present moment to another day not too long ago when he thought his life would amount to more than just a string of storms. And he wonders if it could be true. The voice sounded like the Jesus who he had known, and he remembered that that had to be impossible because he had left Jesus back on the shore. Somehow Jesus found him anyway. So Jesus spoke again, even if simply to confirm Peter's deep but crazy instinct to step out of the boat and into the storm, to unbend his hardened muscles, to throw caution literally to the wind, to stand up inside his little rocking ship and to cross over the stern and step straight into the waves. complete counterintuition. So in addition to all the nuggets that you just said and that we threw out earlier, there has to be at least one more good nugget we could consider holding on to today. Peter's story just has to be the miracle that Jesus can get through a stiff, damp shell of a life and help a body to feel something, to feel anything, even fear. And that wherever Jesus is concerned, even the feeling of fear can be a motivator for faith. When I read Peter's story, it looks for all the world like Jesus does not call Peter out of the storm and into safety. That's how I have always read the story before. Jesus gives Peter permission and just enough confidence to step out of the tiny security he thinks he has created. Jesus calls Peter straight into the uncertain, unpredictable storm. In that miracle motion, Jesus gives Peter permission to see that life can be about something more than just hunkering down and waiting for the storm to pass. Jesus' invitation offers Peter an alternative, one that's made possible by the storm. The storm and the fear help make faith possible. What if that's true? I think this is great news for those of us who think we might follow Jesus one day when we're less exhausted, when we're less beat up, when we're less battered by the constant waves of life. I think it's for those of us who've thought we aren't fit, we aren't ready, we aren't in any position to risk abandoning the miserable but predictable safety we found inside our boats. We'd just rather hunker down. If Peter's perspective is real, then Jesus is calling us out of safety and not into it. Out of the miserable certainty and into the unpredictable, unknowable waves. Out of tiny control and into the wet current where it's possible to know where it's impossible. It's not possible to know for sure where things may end up. Except that it doesn't matter where they end up because we've placed our dependence in the arms of the one who will save us. What if that's true? When Peter stepped into the complexity and into the uncertainty of faith, maybe he didn't know that whether he succeeded or failed, whether he kept the faith or whether he let his doubt get the best of him, the end result was going to be the same. Jesus would be there and Jesus would reach out to save him and us. The only place where Peter's safety was actually in question was the place where he was in charge of it, inside the boat. What if the only place where we actually may not be safe at all is the place where we think we have to control it? If this is the story, then Peter's experience isn't really for those of us who still believe we can make our lifeboats a safe harbor. Instead, it's for those of us who are feeling a hunch that there's a figure calling us into the wind and the waves, beyond the places we thought or knew we could control. It's for those of us who've dabbled in Jesus and who have wondered on occasion whether he really is a miracle worker. It's for those of us who've asked whether hanging around a holy but hard to understand Jesus could lead to a life that's any more different or any more real. It's for those of us who've been about to put the pieces of faith together enough to really believe, but who have more often found ourselves centered in the familiar boat and in the ho-hum but paralyzing storms we've come to call life. Ugh. Sometimes the rescue we need is the one that waits for us as we step out of the boat. What boat are you hunkered down in? What particular waves are you being invited to step out onto? Will we trust, really trust, the one who will always save? Amen.